Welcome to the dark world, where alchemy in the Middle Ages twirled between damnation and salvation. In dark chambers, learnt men labored to acquire knowledge that might either turn base metals into gold or condemn their souls to an eternity of agony. I'd like to know where you're coming from tonight, and what time it is in your part of the world, before we explore these shadowy corners of history. I'm glad to have you join me for this exploration of one of the most misinterpreted arts in history, whether you're spending the night in Prague or waking up in Tokyo. If you're interested in these examinations of humanity's darker periods, click the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss any of our forays into the past. Now turn down the lights and follow me, as I take you back to a period when the line separating magic and science was extremely thin, and one mistake might mean the difference between enlightenment and execution. In the medieval world, the light of knowledge teetered dangerously against the enormous darkness of ignorance and superstition, creating a place of great paradoxes. Alchemy appeared in this twilight world as something much more deadly and alluring than just a crude forerunner to chemistry. It was a prohibited technique that held the promise of transforming not just metals, but also the human soul, therefore unlocking the fundamental secrets of creation itself. Imagine, if you will, a stone room buried beneath a monastery's foundations. The air is heavy with the pungent smoke of sulfur and mercury, and every surface is covered in odd symbols that only the initiated understand. A hooded person stoops over bubbling retorts and burning furnaces here by the flickering light of candles in an attempt to perform what God himself had done during the act of creation. This was the realm of the alchemist, where the sacred and the profane blended into something much darker. We must first recognize how intricately medieval alchemy was woven into the political and spiritual landscape of its era in order to appreciate the full evil that it concealed. The Catholic Church, the imposing organization that controlled every facet of medieval life, was both fascinated and terrified by alchemy. As practitioners themselves, many churchgoers saw art as a means of gaining a deeper understanding of God's creation. The church leadership, on the other hand, understood the inherent risk of letting ordinary people think they could control the basic forces of life. Alchemical practice itself was based on a worldview that was both deeply Christian and subtly heretical. Alchemists held that the physical and metaphysical realms were inseparable and that all matter had a spiritual core. Although converting lead into gold was still the most well-known and sought-after objective, this was more than that. The goal was to complete what they referred to as the magnum opus, or the great work. This would lead to the development of the Philosopher's Stone, a material that might give immortality and perfect wisdom in addition to changing base metals. However, the first seeds of darkness were planted here. Alchemists were effectively asserting that they could duplicate or even exceed heavenly power when they claimed to be able to produce such a stone. In a flawed world, they aimed to create perfection and become lords of life and death, just like the gods themselves. Church officials noted the hubris in such statements and started to view alchemy as a challenge to God's established order rather than merely a natural philosophy. Alchemy's vocabulary was purposefully cryptic, veiled in metaphors and symbols that protected its practitioners from prosecution and safeguarded its secrets. The three philosophical concepts that came to symbolize spirit, soul, and body were mercury, sulfur, and salt, respectively. The marriage of opposites required for transformation was represented by the coupling of the Red King and White Queen. The cyclical nature of the alchemical process was symbolized by dragons eating their own stories. However, there were darker undertones to these ostensibly harmless emblems. Think about the alchemical process's initial step, the negrado, or blackening. This represented the death and putrefaction required before rebirth could take place, and it was more than just a chemical process. In order to prevent the perfect from reincarnating in a greater form, alchemists advocated slaying the king and dissolving it into its constituent chaos. The images were profane to many, violent and unsettling. How could devout Christians, even when using metaphors, talk so carelessly about death and dissolution? Men who were marginalized in society were frequently the practitioners themselves. Scholars who might have studied banned texts too much, doctors who were fed up with the shortcomings of traditional medicine, or just desperate people hoping to profit from a successful transformation. Oaths of secrecy and a common quest for knowledge that the outside world considered harmful united them in secret organizations. The enigmatic Ga, whose exact identity is still up for debate, was one of the most infamous individuals in medieval alchemy. While some believe Geber was a pseudonym adopted by a number of European alchemists, others assert he was the Islamic scholar Jabir ibn Hayyan from the 8th century. Whatever his real nature, the works ascribed to Ga were replete with procedures that almost seemed diabolical. He described the creation of artificial life, materials that could dissolve any substance, and powders that could kill at the first sign of contact. Many alchemists followed progressively sinister pathways in their quest for the Philosopher's Stone. Believing that the same principles that could change metals could also change the human body and soul, some started conducting experiments on human subjects. Alchemists were rumored to have tried to produce hunculi, which are fake humans that are grown in glass jars and fed blood and other unimaginable stuff. If there were such creatures, they were supposed to have knowledge beyond mortal grasp, but only at a price no good person should have to pay. Alchemy's effects on the economy were similarly unsettling. A person could overthrow entire kingdoms in a single day if they could actually turn base metals into gold. The scarcity and inherent value of precious metals were key factors in the careful power dynamics between kings, merchants, and the church. Theoretically, a good alchemist may upset this equilibrium by oversupplying the market with gold and devaluing the currency. Although alchemists surreptitiously funded their research in an attempt to outdo their competitors, it is understandable why many rulers regarded them with mistrust. To most modern viewers, the medieval alchemist's studio would have appeared to be a representation of hell. The air was rife with chemicals and burning materials, producing a toxic atmosphere both physically and symbolically. Every nook was loaded with strange equipment, vessels connected by serpentine tubes in arrangements that appear to be more suited for calling forth demons than for studying natural philosophy. Charts illustrating the relationships between planets, metals, and body organs were frequently displayed on the walls, representing the alchemical notion that the microcosm of human life reflected the macrocosm of the cosmos. Alchemists carried out procedures in these rooms that were named after torture and execution. Calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, putrefaction, coagulation, sation, sublimation, fermentation, exaltation, multiplication, and projection were among the processes they discussed. Every step needed certain circumstances, exact timing, and frequently hazardous materials. Particularly valuable and deadly was mercury, that quicksilver metal that appeared to dwell between liquid and solid phases. Its fumes had the power to drive men insane, resulting in tremors, memory loss, and ultimately death. Alchemists had a tenuous social standing at best. Many practitioners lived in a gray area between respectability and criminality, although some, like Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus, were renowned academics who studied alchemy in addition to their other subjects. They were frequently charged with fraud, especially after their claimed transformations didn't come to pass. When the money did not materialize, kings and nobles who had provided funding for alchemical research occasionally turned violently against their erstwhile protégés, seeing them as scammers who had deceitfully obtained royal monies. Even in the most academic treatises, the relationship between alchemy and magic was always there, brewing beneath the surface. Despite their claims that their art was natural philosophy, alchemists frequently used rituals that were difficult to tell apart from magical activities. They believed that the positions of planets and stars affected the performance of their operations, thus they operated using astrological timing. They utilized symbols that were uncomfortably similar to the sigils used in demonic summoning to inscribe their vessels. They muttered incantations that might have been mistaken for magic and burned incense. The way that alchemy started to affect medical practice was possibly the most unsettling of all. Paracelsus and other physician alchemists asserted that the same laws governing the transmutation of metals could also be used to treat human bodies. They produced medications of previously unheard of strength. Drugs with the potential to treat illnesses that were previously thought to be incurable. However, in higher dosages, these same medications were frequently poisons. It grew more difficult to distinguish between damaging and healing. Some alchemists experimented with more exotic and hazardous materials in their quest for the elixir of life, that fabled substance that may give immortality. They thought that young men's blood held the key to vitality, so they distilled it. From valuable stones, plants, and even human remains, they aimed to extract the essence. In order to create what they dubbed the philosophical mercury that could stop death and decay, some claim to have found ways to preserve the body permanently. The connection between medieval alchemy and corruption and power, however, was arguably its most sinister feature. The advancement of human knowledge was not the primary goal of kings and princes who pursued alchemical science. They desired firearms. Their goal was gold. They desired the capacity to subjugate and control their adversaries. Alchemists' skills could be utilized to make acids that could eat through the toughest armor, explosives that could bring down castle walls, and poisons that left no trace. This perilous confluence of power and expertise was best illustrated by the well-known alchemist John Dee, who advised Queen Elizabeth there. Through his crystal ball, Dee claimed to be able to speak with angels and get orders for alchemical operations that would give England control over the entire world. His power over the Queen was so tremendous that many believed he was enchanting her with alchemical methods and utilizing supernatural powers to change her will to suit his own. Medieval alchemists frequently used techniques in their workshops that appear to be intended to conflate the supernatural with the scientific. Only under specific moon phases would they start working. They carried out complex purification rites on both themselves and their materials because they thought that lunar influences had an impact on the effectiveness of their operations. Observing days of prayer and fasting prior to making significant transmutation attempts. Because of the widespread misogyny in medieval society, some people asserted that a pregnant or menstruating lady may destroy an operation entirely. Alchemical elements were frequently selected not just for their chemical qualities, but also for their symbolic meaning. The earth's blood was symbolized by cinnabar's vivid crimson hue. Due to its ability to refine gold while destroying other metals, antimony came to represent spiritual purification by adversity. Gold symbolized divine perfection, whereas lead, the base metal, represented humanity's fallen existence. These letters were more than just poetry. Alchemists thought they represented essential realities about the nature of the world. It was thought that the alchemist had to mature both technically and spiritually over the course of years or even decades to create the philosopher's stone. In the same way that the stone transcended the base character of common metals, many practitioners asserted that the stone could only be made by someone who had attained a degree of moral and spiritual perfection. Someone who had conquered the base desires of human nature. In order to achieve the purity required for their job, some alchemists adopted severe aesthetic practices, depriving themselves of food, sleep, and human company. However, striving for perfection frequently had the opposite effect. Many alchemists started to show symptoms of insanity after being cut off from the rest of human society, working alone with hazardous materials and being exposed to poisonous vapors. They neglected their families, their health, and their spirits because they were so consumed with their profession. Some reported having visions of the covert procedures they had to follow in order to finish their assignment. However, many in their immediate vicinity believed that these visions were signs of either ordinary insanity or mercury poisoning. Alchemy's economic influence went well beyond the individual practitioners' workshops. Because they recognized the possibility for huge gains, merchants and aristocrats were drawn to invest in the promise of cheap gold. Alchemical research cost entire fortunes, money that could have been used to fund more useful projects or to make the lives of ordinary people better. The economic ramifications of these investments' inevitable failure spread across society and added to the financial instability that afflicted a large portion of medieval Europe. Alchemy and the new universities had a complicated and frequently antagonistic relationship. Some academics saw alchemical studies as a perversion of genuine learning, while others saw it as a valid subfield of natural philosophy. Alchemy required secrecy, but the universities were meant to be places where knowledge was freely exchanged. Reasoned argument was supposed to be used in academic disputes. However, charges of incapacity, deception, or even demonic influence were frequently made in alchemical conflicts. Although the equipment and tools employed by medieval alchemists were works of inventiveness, they also had the capacity to cause harm. The philosopher's furnace, also known as the athanor, had the capacity to melt metals that had never been liquefied before at temperatures that no regular fire could match. The pelican, a vessel intended for constant liquid circulation, has the potential to concentrate chemicals to hazardously high concentrations. The most volatile and reactive components of seemingly stable substances could be separated by the YIC employed for distillation. These were more than just lab apparatus. These sources of power had the potential to be used destructively. Poisons could be concentrated using the same methods used to purify metals. Weapons with previously unheard-of destructive power could be produced in the same furnaces used for transmutation. Some alchemists publicly claimed to be able to produce Greek fire, the fabled incendiary weapon that could burn on water and was impervious to traditional methods of extinguishment. Alchemical practice was shrouded in secrecy for reasons other than preserving trade secrets. It was a matter of survival. The alchemical claim to be able to change substances at their most basic level was perilous in a world where the church might declare someone a heretic for having incorrect views on transubstantiation. Alchemical practitioners were closely monitored by the Inquisition, which was always prepared to look into allegations of heresy or demonic influence. Alchemists employed a coded language to explain their procedures for a number of reasons. By rendering their labor incomprehensible to outsiders, it shielded them from persecution. Additionally, it fostered a feeling of mystery and exclusivity that drew in new practitioners. Most significantly, though, it gave them the ability to make assertions that were difficult to verify or test. If an alchemical operation didn't work, the practitioner could always blame it on misinterpreting the coded instructions instead than a basic problem with the theory. Alchemy's impact on medieval medicine was especially concerning. In the same way that impure metals were formed by imbalances in their elemental composition, physician alchemists asserted that ailments were caused by imbalances in the body's basic principles. This resulted in therapies that were frequently more harmful than the illnesses they were intended to address. Justified by the idea that these poisons might be converted into medications through appropriate alchemical preparation, patients were given mixtures containing mercury, arsenic, and other harmful compounds. The medieval alchemists' perilous goals were best shown by their search for the universal solvent, a material that could dissolve anything. Such a material would have been extremely lucrative for medicinal purposes or for the extraction of precious metals from ores. However, it would also have been an unthinkably destructive weapon. Anyone thinking about the ramifications should have paused at the mere notion of developing something that could dissolve any container, barrier, or defense. Modern thinking would consider the alchemical idea of correspondence, the conviction that all things in the universe were interconnected through unseen sympathies and influences, to be hazardous at worst and crazy at best. Alchemists hold that manipulations of metals may affect human health, that producing artificial gold could provide its maker with supernatural abilities, and that their moral character and spiritual growth would determine whether their labor was successful or not. We can see how this purportedly admirable quest for knowledge became linked with humanity's most fundamental cravings for dominance over others, wealth, and power, as we dig deeper into the murky world of medieval alchemy. In addition to being a place of education, the alchemists' lab served as a forge, where desperation and ambition were transformed into behaviors that endangered the fundamental tenets of medieval civilization. Abuse was especially common in the apprenticeship system that controlled the dissemination of alchemical knowledge. Desperate young men would indenture themselves to masters who might or might not be truly knowledgeable in order to understand the secrets of transformation. These apprentices endured years of work that may have been little more than complex deception, were pledged to secrecy, and were isolated from the outside world. By arguing that the knowledge gained would benefit all of humanity, some masters justified the risk of using their apprentices as test subjects for risky experiments. Medieval society's misogyny was mirrored and intensified by the gender dynamics within alchemical practice. The majority of alchemical practitioners were men who believed that feminine influence corrupted their work, while few women, such as the fabled Mary the Prophetess, were recognized for significant discoveries. Metals being forcibly joined in a procedure known as the chemical wedding, the alchemical process itself was frequently depicted in terms of violent sexual imagery. This was not just metaphorical language. It revealed ingrained ideas about the nature of transformation and power that had unsettling ramifications for these men's perceptions of and interactions with real women. Dangerous knowledge was able to traverse governmental and cultural barriers thanks to the global network of alchemical practitioners. It was simple for texts that had been outlawed in one kingdom to reappear in another after being translated into new languages and modified for regional usage. Through Spain and Sicily, Islamic alchemical knowledge infiltrated Christian Europe, bringing with it beliefs and methods that European authorities deemed dangerous. Similar to this, European inventions made their way into the Islamic world and beyond, establishing a worldwide society of practitioners who were not subject to any earthly authorities. Successful alchemy had far-reaching economic effects that went well beyond the mere production of gold. Alchemists might have complete power over medieval Europe's monetary system if they were able to actually change base metals. The scarcity of precious metals determined the value of currency, and an unrestricted production of gold would have undermined the feudal society's economic underpinnings. In an effort to outdo their rivals and keep their adversaries from making the same discovery, several monarchs covertly supported alchemical research while openly denouncing it. The art was further darkened by the association between astrology and alchemy. Alchemists held that the effectiveness of their operations depended on the placements of planets and stars, and that their work needed to be scheduled in accordance with these celestial effects. Selecting auspicious dates wasn't the only thing at stake. It suggested that cosmic forces beyond of human control influenced human behavior. Such views implied that ultimate authority lay not with God, but with people who could control these unseen forces, undermining the Christian concept of free choice. A parallel lineage of learning developed alongside, and occasionally in opposition to, the official teachings of the universities and the church, as a result of the preservation of alchemical knowledge through coded manuscripts and secret societies. These covert networks made it possible for harmful ideologies to endure persecution and proliferate in ways that were challenging for authorities to keep an eye on or regulate. The very fact that these networks existed suggested that there were realities too risky for the average person to be aware of. Information that needed to be properly protected and shared with only the deserving. Alchemical practice had a serious psychological cost, which was frequently disregarded by people who were only interested in the possible benefits. For years, practitioners worked alone with poisonous substances and performed treatments that frequently failed for inexplicable reasons. Just the continuous exposure to mercury vapor was sufficient to permanently harm the nervous system. However, alchemists also dealt with lead, arsenic, and other chemicals that may gradually build up in the body. The distinction between science and superstition was further blurred when the psychological repercussions of this prolonged poisoning were frequently misinterpreted as divine inspiration or demonic influence. Perhaps the most sinister goal of medieval alchemy was the pursuit of artificial life. Some practitioners claim to have used alchemical procedures to construct homunculi, which are small artificial humans growing in glass jars. It was said that these animals had superhuman intelligence and skills. However, the materials and processes needed to create them would have appalled any moral person. Many people believed that the endeavor to artificially create life was an infringement on God's sovereignty, a sin so serious that the worst penalty was appropriate. Alchemy had a significant impact on medieval warfare that was mostly obscured by historical accounts. Military commanders, alchemists, were doing more than merely improving alloys for armor and weaponry. They were creating incendiary substances, weaponry that went against the Kioalic ideals of medieval warfare, such as poisonous gases. Although the ability to produce such weapons was closely concealed, its existence altered the calculations of European political and military leaders. Alchemy and new banking systems had a complicated and frequently crooked interaction. Traders who professed to be knowledgeable in alchemy could draw creditors and investors, hoping to make money through transmutation. Some allegedly exploited this information to support complex financial schemes that were essentially Ponzi or pyramid scams in their early stages. Whole banking dynasties and trade houses were frequently brought down with these plans when they eventually failed, adding to the economic instability that afflicted much of medieval Europe. Because alchemy blended real therapeutic results with poisonous side effects in ways that were not fully understood, its medicinal uses were especially risky. Mercury or antimony containing alchemical remedies may be able to treat some illnesses, but they may also permanently harm the kidneys, neurological system, or other organs. After recovering from their initial ailment, patients may develop additional conditions brought on by their therapy, which can lead to a vicious cycle of reliance on increasingly unusual and risky cures. Alchemy's spiritual claims were arguably its most pernicious feature, since they provided ostensibly holy explanations for actions that were essentially selfish and materialistic. Alchemists asserted that their work was a kind of prayer, that the philosopher's stone represented divine favor, and that the transformation of metals reflected the soul's path to perfection. It was more difficult for church leaders to denounce their actions without seeming to be against spiritual growth itself because of these assertions, which enabled them to frame their quest for riches and power as a kind of religious devotion. Medieval alchemical practitioners were primarily preoccupied with their short-term objectives and failed to consider the serious environmental effects of their work. Large amounts of wood and charcoal were required in the transmutation furnaces, which led to deforestation in important alchemical activity hubs. Failed trials frequently resulted in the poisonous waste products being buried in small trenches or simply dumped into rivers, damaging soil and water supplies for millennia. Constant emissions of sulfur compounds, mercury vapor, and other harmful gases contaminated the air surrounding alchemical operations. We walk away from our investigation into the murky depths of medieval alchemy with a depressing realization of how humankind's highest ideals can be tainted when they are pursued without consideration for societal duty or moral restraints. For the most part, medieval alchemists were not malevolent individuals. They were ambitious and curious knowledge seekers who hoped to discover mysteries that would help all of humanity. However, their practices, their secrecy, and their readiness to overlook the possible repercussions of their labors produced a tradition that was both seductive and deadly. Medieval alchemy left behind a legacy that goes well beyond the eventual advancement of contemporary chemistry. It created trends of elites hoarding knowledge, conducting research in secret, and pursuing scientific advancements without considering their social ramifications. From the Renaissance's alchemist workshops to the Atomic Age's covert laboratories, these themes would recur repeatedly throughout history. Instead of supernatural evil, the actual darkness of medieval alchemy was found in the very human propensity to seek knowledge and power without wisdom, to seek transformation without comprehension, and to promise miracles while creating monsters. the medieval alchemists discovered something much more unsettling in their attempt to turn base metals into gold. The awful cost society incurs when bright individuals pursue their goals unbridled, and how easily good intentions can be tainted. Maybe you'll dream about those old workshops with their flaming fires and seething retorts, where men in robes hunched over their enigmatic work when you go to sleep tonight. However, keep in mind that the true horror of medieval alchemy lay not in its failures, but in its partial successes, the times when practitioners saw true power and decided to go for it at any costs. There were many mysteries in the medieval world, but none were more dangerous than the dubious art of alchemy. A small number of peasants ventured into prohibited knowledge that held unimaginable power, while the others worked in the fields under the careful eye of their masters. These were desperate individuals living on the periphery of society, carrying out their experiments in secret cellars and deserted monasteries, away from the prying eyes of church officials, rather than the educated scholars of major universities. You see, alchemy had developed well beyond the mere conversion of base metals into gold by the 14th century. It had turned into something more sinister, something that endangered the fundamental tenets of medieval civilization. This generation of alchemists wasn't satisfied with material prosperity, the creation of life itself, the ability to evade death and control over the natural world, all of which God had decreed, were the ultimate goals they pursued. In order to undertake the noble task, a Benedictine monk named Brother Marcus broke his vows in 1347. He built an intricate laboratory with glass jars, furnaces, and occult apparatus in the gloomy cellars beneath the ruins of an abandoned priory. Even contemporary scientists would shudder in terror at the experiments documented in his journals, which were uncovered centuries later. He described how, under certain astrological circumstances, human blood might be combined with sulfur and mercury to create artificial beings known as hunuli. The procedure itself was a hideous satire of the sacred act of creation. Marcus would start when the moon was dark, when evil spirits were supposedly most active. He would add drops of blood taken from condemned convicts just before their execution, and he would heat mercury in a sealed vessel for 40 days and nights. He asserted that an unclean life of its own would cause the ensuing mixture to writhe and pulsate. Marcus, however, wasn't working alone. Through secret symbols carved into monastery walls and coded texts, a network of renegade alchemists spread their knowledge of banned substances throughout Europe. To hide their true intentions from those who would burn them as heretics, they spoke in a language of lions and dragons, of red monarchs and white queens. The church reacted quickly and brutally. The papal bull Spondent Quas non exhibent, published in 1317 by Pope Innocent IV, categorically denounced alchemical techniques as demonic practices. However, this just served to push the practitioners farther underground, increasing the risk of their job and the severity of their techniques. Consider the well-known instance of the Parisian scrivener, Nicholas F. Flamel, who professed to have found the Philosopher's Stone. Although he is remembered throughout history as a great alchemist who accomplished transmutation, his methods reveal a darker side. A channel house of experimentation, Flamel's workshop was concealed beneath his scriptorum. He believed that life essence was the essential ingredient in his elixir of immortality, so he used human remains, grave dirt, and infant blood in his creations. These practitioners suffered greatly psychologically. Long-term exposure to mercury fumes results in hallucinations, tremors, and progressive mental decline. Some alchemists claim to have established agreements with infernal powers in exchange for knowledge, while many others described having vivid dreams in which demons guided them in their work. The distinction between demonic possession and scientific investigation got more hazy. Medieval alchemy was especially pernicious because of its parasitic connection to respectable education. Heretical practices flourished in monasteries, which were hubs of scholastic activity. Monks who had access to historical writings and scientific equipment were lured into ever riskier experiments. The very organizations created to protect Christian knowledge were internally compromised. Drawing on Islamic, Jewish, and pagan traditions, the alchemists created a complex mythology around their work, claiming ancestry from Hermes Trismegistus. They thought that by using their art, they could undo the fall of man and bring humanity back to Adam's original state before sin corrupted it. It was more than just metallurgy. It directly contradicted Christian doctrine. Just the equipment conveys a sense of danger and obsession. Pelicans and retorts, each made for a certain step of the great operation, were commonplace in alchemical laboratories. These areas were almost intolerable due to the continuous heat from furnaces and the stench of sulfur and burning metals. Due to their job, several alchemists sustained serious burns and lung damage. But they persevered, motivated by ideas of supreme power. The human tests were possibly the most unsettling. The microcosm of the human body, according to medieval alchemists, mirrored the macrocosm of the cosmos. They performed vivisections on mentally ill people and convicted criminals, attempting to comprehend the process of life itself and the location of the soul. A total rejection of Christian morals was demonstrated by these covert, unethical activities. Alchemy's influence on society went well beyond its individual practitioners. The failure of an alchemist's experiments might devastate entire villages. Wells were poisoned by toxic vapors. Buildings were destroyed by strange fires, and mysterious diseases proliferate among people. Due to their ignorance of chemistry, the populace blamed witchcraft and demonic influence for these catastrophes, which sparked enormous hysteria and witch hunts. The interruption to the economy was just as bad, because alchemists claimed to be able to create gold. Monetary manipulation and counterfeiting became commonplace. The stability of medieval monetary systems was threatened by the covert patronage of alchemical research by kings and nobles who were anxious for money to finance their wars. As destructive to society as any acid in the alchemist's lab was the promise of limitless money. Although they participated in this dark world in different ways, women were also lured to it. Using their expertise in distillation and botanicals, female alchemists frequently focused on poisons and loved making potions that had the power to either kill or control. These ladies worked in the background of medieval society, assisting aristocrats who required their spouses to be submissive or their foes to be discreetly vanquished. The religious ramifications were frightening and deep. By substituting confidence in human control over natural forces for faith in God's will, alchemy constituted a fundamental denial of divine providence. Alchemists viewed themselves as either competitors to divine power or co-creators with God. According to Catholic dogma, this hubris invariably resulted in spiritual corruption and eternal damnation. Complex security procedures were needed to preserve alchemical knowledge. Manuscripts were buried in isolated places, concealed behind fake walls, or written in several codes. The most hazardous formulas were memorized and transmitted through master-apprentice networks, establishing covert lineages that endured for many years. In order to prevent any one person from having too much power, some information was purposefully broken up, with various practitioners holding bits of more comprehensive formulas. By the end of the Middle Ages, alchemy had become deeply ingrained in European culture. What started out as a search for tangible change evolved into a thorough philosophical framework that questioned every facet of medieval existence. The foundations of occultism and magical thought that would endure for generations were sown in alchemical laboratories, together with the seeds of the scientific revolution. The perils of pursuing knowledge without moral restraints are starkly brought to light by the legacy of medieval alchemy. These practitioners developed a shadow science that functioned outside the boundaries of societal and religious authority because they were desperate and ambitious. Although it came at a horrific cost in terms of human lives and social stability, their work enhanced human understanding of chemistry and metallurgy. The success of medieval alchemy in transforming human souls into something unrecognizable, rather than its inability to convert lead into gold, was its real dark side. The quest for transmutation was only the start of alchemy's sinister journey into forbidden lands. Practitioners started to investigate areas that the church and society considered not only heretical, but also seriously harmful as they dug further into the secrets of matter and spirit. The alchemical lab, tucked away in isolated forest clearings or castle dungeons, transformed into a theater of operations where the lines separating magic and science vanished entirely. The achievement of medieval alchemy in producing something far more terrible than gold was what really made it gloomy. A system of classified information that put medieval society's fundamentals in jeopardy. Alchemists started to believe that they were a select few who had access to divine truths that made them superior to ordinary people. They would follow courses that still appear astonishing in their moral blindness and bravado as a result of this arrogance. Take the example of Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar from the 13th century, whose alchemical endeavors led to his own order's suspicion. Experiments that extended well beyond the basic transmutation of base metals are hinted at in Bacon's carefully coded writings to evade punishment. He wrote about manipulating alchemy to control the very forces of nature, producing artificial life and extending human existence endlessly. It was said that Albertus Magnus, his contemporaries, had constructed a homunculus that was capable of human-like speech and reasoning. These weren't just experiments in metaphor or fantasy. The alchemists of the Middle Ages sincerely thought they could make life out of inanimate substance, and they worked towards this objective with an almost obsessive zeal. According to alchemical writings, a homunculus was made by mixing human biological fluids with different metals and minerals, then exposing the concoction to exact cycles of heating and cooling over the course of months or even years. Such experiments' ethical ramifications were either disregarded or explained away with complex theological arguments. The quest for immortality through alchemy turned out to be considerably riskier. Medieval alchemists frequently sought immortality via techniques that necessitated the exploitation or destruction of others, in contrast to contemporary medical science, which aims to prolong healthy human life. Some practitioners claimed that human sacrifice was necessary to create the fabled Philosopher's Stone. Throughout his life, there were rumors that Nicholas Fll, arguably the most well-known alchemist of the Middle Ages, had attained immortality through his alchemical work. However, there were also rumors concerning the real reason for his longevity. There was some truth to these rumors. Disturbing references to the use of human blood, organs, and other body parts in various experiments may be found in alchemical books from the time period. Alchemists' attempts to control the life force itself caused the distinction between necromancy and alchemy to become more hazy. According to some alchemists, it was possible to extract the essence of youth from the young and transmit it to the elderly, resulting in gruesome experiments that would not be out of place in the most gruesome horror films. These activities were even more sinister because of the secrecy that surrounded them. Alchemists created complex networks of metaphors, codes, and symbols to hide their work from inquisitive eyes. Instructions for making lethal poisons or using ritual magic may be included in what seemed to be a formula for turning lead into gold. When interpreted as a metaphor for the never-ending cycle of creation and destruction that alchemists attempted to conquer, the well-known alchemical symbol of the Ouroboros, the serpent devouring its own tail, took on new significance. This secretive civilization produced its own evil. Peer pressure and collective complicity caused alchemical civilizations to deteriorate into narrow groups where moral boundaries were progressively undermined. Young apprentices were gradually exposed to more dubious methods. Through a mix of gradual exposure to terror and cerebral rationalization, their consciences were numbed. Without taking into account the costs to people or the moral ramifications, the quest for knowledge became into an end in and of itself. Alchemy's corruption was also influenced by its financial incentives. Experiments were funded by wealthy sponsors who were anxious for cash or eternal life, and few methodological questions were raised. The challenge for alchemists was to generate outcomes using whatever methods were necessary. Because of this pressure, practitioners risked everything in an attempt to win the ultimate reward, which resulted in increasingly risky and desperate trials. Alchemists' moral decline was exacerbated by their social exclusion. They established their own societies with their own set of moral principles after being shunned by the church and the general public. In alchemical circles, what would have been unimaginable to the average medieval citizen became commonplace. Stealing bodies from cemeteries, snatching human life for scientific research, and abducting children for gruesome ceremonies. In the perverse logic of alchemical pursuit, all of these were accepted. The manner that true scientific advancement was entangled with these sinister methods was perhaps the most unsettling of all. Alchemists did make significant contributions to medicine, chemistry, and metal smithing. They improved knowledge of natural processes, found novel chemical compounds, and created new distillation methods. However, the darker facets of their work were inextricably linked to these respectable accomplishments, resulting in a corpus of knowledge that was both cursed and beneficial. In these trials, the equipment itself narrates its journey into darkness. Strange gadgets for manipulating life itself, as well as chemical processes, were common in alchemical laboratories. In order to process human blood and other body fluids, distillation apparatus was adapted. Furnaces were made to hold items that were never handled by a real craftsman. The inscriptions and symbols on glass jars were all about calling forth and binding supernatural energies, and they had nothing to do with chemistry. The alchemists themselves suffered greatly psychologically. Many had symptoms of what we now know to be serious mental disease, caused by social isolation, exposure to hazardous drugs, and the cognitive dissonance of acquiring information through ever more immoral means. Later works by them frequently exhibit grandiosity, paranoia, and a total detachment from typical human empathy. They started to view other individuals as suppliers of raw materials for their experiments rather than as fellow humans. The corruption contaminated large networks of alchemists, not just individual practitioners. Secret organizations emerged that were focused on gaining power through alchemical techniques rather than advancing knowledge. These organizations used their secret information to influence events behind the scenes by infiltrating merchant guilds, royal courts, and even places of worship. They were able to function without supervision or accountability because of the same concealment that shielded them from persecution. These networks started to seriously threaten social stability as their influence and power increased. When they discovered too late that alchemists had unleashed forces beyond their control, the kings and nobles who had previously supported them started to fear them. In addition to producing money, alchemists' knowledge could be utilized to make poisons that were invisible to the naked eye, manipulate people's thoughts chemically and remotely, cause adversaries to die or go insane. Although little was known at the time, alchemical activities had a significant negative impact on the environment. The use of mercury, lead, arsenic, and other deadly compounds in proportions that poisoned entire regions surrounding alchemical laboratories was necessary in the pursuit of transmutation. Numerous animals perished, soil became barren, and wells were poisoned. The alchemists themselves frequently experienced heavy metal poisoning, which might have played a role in their moral blindness and more unpredictable behavior. Medieval alchemy's greatest tragedy was not that it failed to accomplish its declared objectives, but rather that it was successful in showing how far people would go in their quest for power and knowledge. The practitioners who started out as truth seekers turned into death dealers. Their labs changed from being educational spaces to terrifying hauntings. How medieval alchemists worked for outlawed masters remains a mystery. However, many alchemists were pulled into darker realms even as they sought these lofty ideals of enlightenment and transmutation, territories that need their souls as well as their expertise. You see, there's usually a cost associated with seeking out knowledge that is prohibited. Additionally, throughout the Middle Ages, this cost was frequently incurred through corruption, bloodshed, and enslavement to forces that ought never to have been roused. Think about the enigmatic character of Brother Augustine, a Franciscan monk who managed a covert laboratory under the Sandin Monastery in the 13th century. During the day, he appeared to be devoted to his religious obligations and provided medical care to the ill. At night, he entered rooms hewn out of living rock, where the walls were inscribed in languages older than Christ's own, and the air was heavy with sulfurous fumes. Centuries later, Augustine's notebooks were found bricked up behind a false wall, revealing the slow degeneration of a man who started out with good intentions. His early writings mention his desire to turn lead into gold in order to finance the monastery's charity endeavors and to develop medications for the underprivileged. You see, Augustine had used his alchemical skills to connect with something that gave him power he could never have imagined, yet insisted on ever higher sacrifices. It was fairly easy at first. His own blood was mixed into the crucible in a few drips. The offering of lab animals as sacrifices at particular times of the moon. However, when one trafficked to graveyards where Augustine would gather bone dust from the recently buried, the demands increased as they always do. They describe rituals he performed at midnight in secret rooms, burning offerings of rare herbs and reciting spells that caused his throat to bleed just to say them. Eventually, they exposed the ultimate horror. Augustine was a member of a network of corrupted alchemists operating throughout medieval Europe, all of whom were working for the same evil overlords. The shadow side of medieval alchemy was symbolized by this network, which they dubbed the Order Mortis Ae, or the Order of the Golden Death. Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus, two public-facing alchemists, studied within the parameters of Christian doctrine. These covert practitioners engaged in practices that, had their activities been uncovered, would have resulted in their burning as heretics. Crucifixes hung upside down in their laboratories, which were shrines to corruption, and their instruments of the trade were consecrated with blood instead of holy water. They dealt with compounds that were against natural law in addition to sulfur and mercury. Meteorites in powder form, glowing with their own inner light. Essences that have crystallized from plague victims' last breath. Plants that flourished exclusively in soil wet with innocent blood produced oils. They carried out absurd parodies of Christian mass ceremonies in which the host was elevated by a priest. These tainted alchemists would lift containers full of molten silver and seething mixtures of human bile. The air itself shimmered with evil force as they sang formula in the Enochian tongue where hymns ought to have been sung. The total reversal of the natural order was their ultimate objective. They were looking for something even darker than the philosopher's stone of legend, the lapis mortis, or death stone, a material that could give immortality by consuming life energy itself. Every component used in the development of this monster has to be systematically corrupted in order to produce it. It was necessary to extract water from wells tainted with saints' bones. Wood from lightning-stricken trees had to be used to start fires during thunderstorms. Air had to be recorded during the last breaths of individuals dying in despair, and earth had to be collected from the views of mass graves. Every element included spiritual corruption in addition to physical characteristics that tainted whatever it came into contact with. According to legend, the alchemist would progressively seed bits of their humanity to their evil customers over the course of 7 years in order to create the Death Stone. They would start to age more slowly, but at a very high price. As alien knowledge took the place of their memories, many would become insane. Entities from beyond the veil would inhabit their bodies, sharing space with consciousnesses that considered human misery to be amusing. The culmination of his outstanding effort is detailed in Brother Augustine's last entries. He describes how the Death Stone eventually came together in his crucible, becoming a sphere of complete darkness that appeared to eat light itself. However, his victory was fleeting. A single line that has been repeated countless of times marks the sudden end of the notebook. They are here to gather. They are here to gather. 3 days later, his body was discovered, still in its human shape but aged to dust. Only his robes and the horrible information he kept in his secret laboratory remained after a light touch reduced him to a heap of grey powder. Augustinar was not the end of the Order of the Golden Death. If nothing else, his tragedy acted as a warning, making the remaining members even more cautious in their actions. They created complex communication protocols that were concealed within alchemical treatises that appeared to be benign. In large cities, they established safe homes where members could seek refuge when their actions drew unwanted attention. And they enlisted fresh recruits among the ambitious and the desperate, people who would gladly exchange their souls for a taste of power that is prohibited. Young alchemists who had demonstrated promise but lacked the funds to continue their education legally were frequently the focus of these recruitment campaigns. Through middlemen, the Order would reach out to them, providing access to rare literature and resources that were unavailable through regular routes. The first requests appeared to be very innocuous. Take note of this formula. Try this process. Use the appropriate channels to report your findings. However, the young alchemist would be pulled farther into the crooked network of the Order with every mission they accomplished. They replicated formulations with secret meanings that only became apparent when paired with other formulas. Increasingly dubious materials were needed for the methods they tested, and the outcomes they reported were utilized to advance the Order's ultimate objective of creating permanent portals between their evil patron's realms and our own. Eleanor of Padua, a bright young woman who had pretended to be a man in order to attend the university, was one such recruit. Order officials were drawn to her innate aptitude for alchemical activity because they perceived both her promise and her fragility. Elena was especially vulnerable to their offers of help because she was caught between her curiosity and her ongoing anxiety of being found out. They gave her access to a private lab where she could work without worrying about being discovered. They provided her with access to books that the church had long prohibited. And they gave her the opportunity to pursue the noble task without the persistent meddling of male classmates who questioned her eligibility to study with them. Elena was unaware that her study was gradually being tainted by her new clients. Subtle changes had been made to the texts they supplied, adding heretical components to otherwise acceptable alchemical processes. They provided her with a laboratory that was constructed over a location where the organization had performed human sacrifices for many years, and the very walls were infused with evil energy that affected her thoughts. Elena's work started to shift gradually. Her research of animal humors followed her initial work with plant essences. She started off trying to purify base metals, but eventually she started trying to ruin precious ones. And she turned her search for the Philosopher's Stone into something much darker, the production of artificial entities called homunculi that are animated by human souls that have been imprisoned. Elena created a method that was a masterwork of tainted alchemy. She would start by combining bone marrow, human blood, and semen with particular minerals that were only present in certain cursed places. For 40 days and 40 nights, this combination would be buried in consecrated ground after being sealed in a glass container. In order to give it the required spiritual vitality, Elena would carry out regular rituals throughout that period. The contents would have changed into a meaty mass of the size and shape of a human newborn by the time the vessel was eventually discovered. However, this was not how God intended life to be. A human soul, taken from its natural course to the hereafter and destined to serve its maker, was the source of the homunculus's animation. Because of their unnatural existence, these souls, trapped in artificial flesh, went insane and caused great agony to everyone they came into contact with. Before Elena realized the true nature of her art, she produced dozens of these monstrosities. When she saw the face of her first homunculus, it dawned on her. It resembled her younger brother, who had passed away from plague the year before. His spirit had apparently been taken by the Order on its way to the hereafter, and Elena used it as raw material for her research. Elena tried to destroy her creatures and reveal the Order's operations to the church authorities because she was horrified by what she had done. However, this possibility had been foreseen in the Order. Elena was discovered in her laboratory the night she intended to leave Padua with proof of their crimes, her face frozen in a look of sheer panic and her body twisted in unfathomable ways. Excessive study-induced heart failure was listed as the official cause of death. However, the people who discovered her observed that all of the glass containers in the lab were broken from the inside, as though something had made a valiant attempt to get out. For years, there were rumors of weird youngsters wandering the countryside around Padua, but the homunculi were never located. Children whose touch drove everyone they came in contact with insane and who cast no shadows. Elenena's story was one of many that were whispered in the back alleys of medieval society as a warning to anyone who might be enticed to seek knowledge at any cost. However, for every alchemist who paid attention to these cautions, there were others who viewed them as obstacles to be surmounted. Many were unable to resist the allure of forbidden authority, and during the Middle Ages, the Golden Death Order grew stronger. They had an impact that went well beyond any one alchemist. Offering their services to monarchs and nobles who wanted to dominate their adversaries, they penetrated royal courts. They set up covert schools where affluent youngsters might learn the dark arts in addition to more traditional disciplines. Additionally, they established extensive networks of informants and spies who assisted them in spotting possible dangers to their operations. The total change of human society was the ultimate aim of the Order. They thought they might weaken the boundaries between dimensions and enable their otherworldly patrons to permanently incarnate in our reality by corrupting enough people and causing enough turmoil in the planet. This would mark the beginning of a new era in which the natural order would be disrupted and the tainted world would be ruled by people who had aided the dark powers. In order to accomplish this, they had to corrupt alchemy as a whole, not just certain alchemists. They started inserting misleading material into authentic works, which caused misunderstanding and skepticism among sincere practitioners. In the view of secular authorities, they discredited the entire field by sponsoring public demonstrations of alchemical methods that ended in spectacular failures. They disseminated false information that connected alchemy to heresy and witchcraft, which would force practitioners into hiding places where the Order could more readily keep them under control. The building of what they dubbed the Magnum Maleficium, or Great Evil Deed, was the Order's most ambitious endeavor. This was to be a large-scale alchemical operation carried out concurrently in several European locales, created with the intention of permanently rupturing reality so that its customers could cross over during Mass. Dozens of corrupted alchemists had to precisely coordinate the ritual, with each one carrying out their portion of the larger task at precisely the proper time. The amount of preparation required was astounding. It was necessary to collect rare resources from all around the known globe. It took months of preparatory procedures to identify and prepare sites of ancient power. Additionally, the date had to be planned to align with an uncommon astronomical alignment that only happened once every several millennia. The Order toiled towards this objective for 3 years, giving up everything to achieve their final triumph. They gave up all pretense of secrecy, actively seeking out new members, and setting up labs in important European cities. Church authorities who looked too carefully into their actions were killed, and they started hoarding the enormous amounts of tainted materials that they would need for their magnificent endeavor. However, their hubris ultimately led to their demise. The most eminent investigators in the church eventually took notice of the scope of their operations. Men who have received specialized training to deal with supernatural dangers. These detectives started methodically pursuing Order members and demolishing their labs under the direction of an enigmatic character who went by the name Father Morai. Father Morai was a former alchemist who devoted his life to fighting the powers the Order served after catching a glimpse of their true nature. He knew their shortcomings because he had previously shared them, and he comprehended their strategies because he had previously used them himself. Armed with protective talismans and consecrated weaponry, his detectives worked with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they were up against. The night the Order tried to execute the Magnum Maleficium was the last encounter. Father Morai's soldiers hit several places at once as alchemists all throughout Europe started their coordinated ritual. The ensuing conflicts, which combined physical combat with supernatural warfare to destroy entire city blocks, were unheard of before or since. It was reported that the combat that broke out in London's Order's laboratory, which was concealed beneath the tower itself, caused the tides to turn crimson for 3 days. The battle in Paris was focused on Notre Dame Cathedral, where members of the Order had tried to taint the site's foundations. The ancient dead awoke to protect their resting places from sacrilege as the fight raged in the catacombs in Rome. The loss of the Order was catastrophic and complete. Members who survived the battle were sent to special church tribunals, where they were sentenced to punishments harsher than death. In order to prevent the corruption they held from ever spreading, their laboratories were not only demolished, but also dedicated. Additionally, their writings and materials were collected and kept safe in the Vatican's deepest vaults, where they are still today. However, the cost of the victory was severe. Even yet, the unfinished Magnum Maleficium has succeeded in eroding the boundaries between realms, causing dozens of tiny cracks that let lesser beings enter our reality. Many of the monster legends that afflicted Europe for years following were based on these animals that preyed on human dread and pain. Furthermore, after the Order was destroyed, its remaining members were dispersed throughout the world, where they formed new cells and started the gradual process of reorganizing. They changed their strategies to operate in the shifting intellectual environment of the Renaissance and beyond, learnt from their blunders, and became more cautious and covert in their hiring. A sobering reminder of the perils involved in pursuing knowledge that is prohibited is provided by the legacy of the Order of the Golden Death. Despite its true scientific accomplishments, medieval alchemy also created opportunities that ought to have remained closed. It drew people who were prepared to forego not just their own humanity, but even the security of the entire human race in the name of power and immortality. The path of sorrow that these perverted practitioners left behind went much beyond their own lives. When their masters passed away, the things they called forth didn't just disappear. They did not cause the rifts to automatically close. And instead of vanishing with them, the knowledge they had acquired was passed on to new generations of seekers who thought they could succeed where their forebears had failed. Fragments of their work remain in the vaults of noble families and the secret archives of old monasteries. Partial formulations written in difficult-to-read languages. Diagrams of ritual circles that, when viewed up close, appear to move and alter. And cautions were written in the margins by people who realized the seriousness of what they had found and made a valiant effort to keep others from going down the same sinister route. The insidious corruption of those who started out with good intentions is the real horror of the shadow side of medieval alchemy, not the dramatic conflicts between good and evil. All members of the Order of the Golden Death began as individuals seeking enlightenment, healing, or knowledge. However, they gradually gave in to pressures that eventually drained them of not only their spirits, but also their humanity, concession after compromise. What's even scarier is that they seem to like it. It is evident from the remaining documents that these tainted alchemists truly enjoyed their sinister endeavors. They took great pride in their dominance over others. They took great pleasure in their accumulation of prohibited knowledge. They discovered a perverse fulfillment in working for rulers whose ultimate objective was to destroy everything they had previously valued. This, then, was the real, sinister reality of alchemy in the Middle Ages. It might turn good people into willing servants of evil, not only because it was risky or that it occasionally failed. It provided a seemingly rational and legitimate route to power, but for those who took it too far, it ultimately resulted in damnation. Additionally, it created a rotten legacy that still has an impact on the obscure nooks and crannies of our world. These statements will be seen as both wisdom and caution by the astute reader. Power without wisdom is destruction, but knowledge is power. Pursuing the truth is admirable, but when it is done without moral guidance, it turns into a falsehood in and of itself. Furthermore, although natural and comprehensible, the urge to surpass human limitations might result in the loss of everything that first defines us as human. The echoes of medieval alchemy's deepest secrets can still be heard in the flickering candlelight of old laboratories, in the hushed incantations of long-forgotten rites, and in the frantic cries of those who paid the ultimate price for knowledge that was prohibited. No one could have predicted how deeply the blood of innocence penetrates the soil. There was a far darker reality hidden behind the ceremonial circles and ethereal symbols that the general public saw in moonlit clearings. Doorways that should never have been opened had been opened by the order of the Golden Death. Even the most seasoned alchemists shrank in dread when creatures of such evilness emerged from the emptiness beyond. These otherworldly creatures insisted on being paid in the money that meant the most to them: spiritual degeneration and human misery. Intoxicated by their newfound authority, the order complied with ease. They created subterranean rooms beneath manor houses and monasteries, places dedicated backwards, where victims' cries would never be heard. Here, they carried out tests that would make making hunkuli appear simple. The possessed alchemists started gathering the souls of their victims, not only their blood and organs. They created what they dubbed soul stones by learning how to capture spiritual energy in crystalline matrices. The confined consciousness pulsed through these artifacts. Within their glass confines, the consciousness of the murdered remains intact. At a cost that would be felt for decades, the stones were used as focal points for ceremonial magic of hitherto unheard-of power. The corruption swept across the alchemical community like a plague. These darker talents were chosen above the noble endeavors of masters who had spent decades searching for the Philosopher's Stone. They discovered how to turn hatred into powerful elixirs that might drive entire populations insane, how to crystallize despair, and how to distill dread itself. Birds died in the air, and crops withered in neighboring fields as the very air surrounding their labs grew heavy with evil energy. A covert conflict sprang out as soon as the church leadership learnt of these abominations. Armed with holy water and consecrated silver, inquisitors ventured into suspected alchemical strongholds to discover chambers deserted but for the faint sound of unearthly laughter and the lingering stink of sulfur. By working in areas that existed between dimensions, the Order had mastered the art of concealing their operations not just from onlookers, but also from the actual physical world. The real terror had not yet arrived. The extraterrestrial beings had not only arrived to destroy and corrupt. For something much worse, they were scouts clearing the path. They started building a vast ceremonial machinery that covered all of medieval Europe with the help of their human servants. Nodes in a large network of evil energy were generated by desecrated holy sites, corrupted churches, and stone circles. This expanding network of evil gained strength with every successful ceremony, every innocent life taken, and every soul imprisoned in crystalline bondage. The total inversion of reality itself was the ultimate aim of the organization. In order to let their otherworldly lords flood the mortal planet like a living nightmare, they aimed to rip open a permanent portal between realms. They have discovered that the Philosopher's Stone was never intended to turn lead into gold. It was a cosmic instrument, a key, made to break down the barriers between realms and bring about a period of unending darkness. In the few years before the Great Dying, the few medieval chroniclers who lived to document these occurrences described extraordinary portents. At midday, the moon poured scarlet light across the landscape, and the sun would occasionally appear dark. Children spoke in tongues they had never learnt, and animals were born with missing faces or extra limbs. Creation itself seems to be coming apart at the seams. The response from the church became more and more desperate. Monasteries as a whole were called upon to pray continuously. They prayed constantly, their voices rising against the encroaching darkness. Protected by knights who had sworn an oath of silence, holy relics were transported in clandestine convoys. It was said that the Pope himself aged 10 years in one night by performing dreadful and old rituals. His eyes became pools of reflected stars, and his hair turned white. The fate of the regular people caught up in this supernatural conflict, however, was possibly the most horrifying of all. Overnight, entire communities would just disappear, leaving behind nothing except the stench of burned offerings and deserted homes. Farmers would discover their animals in exact geometric configurations, bloodless yet without any injuries. Children would leave their beds and come back days later, talking of lovely gardens with rivers flowing with silver liquid and flowers growing from human bones. They were so thoroughly corrupted by the order that they had lost any human characteristics. Other worldly energies have started to alter their bodies. Some acquired extra eyes with the ability to see across dimensional boundaries. Others were able to control reality itself by growing appendages that were partially present in other universes. Normal people were poisoned by their very presence, and everyone who came into contact with them suffered from illness, madness, and spiritual decay. The texts they had accumulated, written in languages that existed before human civilization, filled libraries that existed in folded space. These tomes included maps of cosmic regions where the laws of physics were only suggestions, formulas for breaking the bonds that bound atoms together, and instructions for calling out entities whose names could not be spoken without rupturing reality. The Order of the Golden Death was on the brink of accomplishing their ultimate objective as the medieval era came to an end. The huge ritual was almost finished. Centuries of misuse have eroded the dimensional barriers. Their earlier atrocities would appear like soft mercy as they believed that the age of humanity would end in an orgy of cosmic terror, and their otherworldly lords would soon march forth into the mortal realm. A warning that reverberates down the years is the legacy of the darkest period of medieval alchemy. Corruption and destruction are inevitable outcomes of pursuing knowledge without wisdom, power without accountability, and transcendence without morality. The destiny of the Order serves as a reminder that certain things cannot be closed once they are opened, and that certain costs cannot be reimbursed once they have been paid. They had evolved into something far worse than any demon as a result of their unrelenting desire to transcend human limitations. It could have been the product of fevered imaginations. Their deeds have left a legacy that extends well beyond the Middle Ages, impacting occult groups and secret societies that continue to exist today. There has always been a costly cost associated with seeking out forbidden knowledge, but in medieval alchemy, that cost was frequently greater than anybody could have predicted. We've looked at how alchemists defied natural law, creating gateways to other worlds and calling out beings that were incomprehensible to humans, but the real evil had not yet been shown. For the most ambitious practitioners started to realize a dreadful truth in the privacy of their labs, away from moral judgment and prying ears. The ultimate sacrifice would be necessary for their greatest findings. A significant change started to occur as word of the botched ritual circulated among the clandestine networks of alchemical practitioners. The disastrous attempt to break through the basic limits of reality had been successful in ways that its creators had never anticipated. The ritual had produced something far more frightening than a controlled portal to otherworldly power. Fissures in the basic basis of life itself. These fissures, which are invisible to the naked eye, but clearly visible to those who are knowledgeable about the hidden arts, started to release energies that were beyond comprehension. The initial indications were faint. Strange events were reported by practitioners conducting research in labs hundreds of kilometers away from the ceremony site. Colors without labels would burn spontaneously in transmutation circles. Philosophical mercury would twist and squirm as though it were alive, creating patterns that were painful to observe up close. Worst of all, the homunculi that alchemists had worked so hard to produce started to behave in ways that indicated they were no longer completely controlled by their maker. One of the first people to record these alterations was Brother Marcus, who worked in his secret laboratory under the St. Aldrich Monastery. As his meticulously planned experiments started to produce unexpected effects, his diary entries from this time period show an increasing sense of disquiet. He used to be able to consistently turn base metals into silver, but these days his furnaces produce materials that appear to exist in several states at once. Once docile and submissive, his homunculus started speaking in languages that existed before human civilization, describing worlds that existed outside of the conventional bounds of time and space. Even more concerning were the rumors that alchemists were just disappearing from their labs that were coming in from all around Europe. These were not instances of practitioners running away from persecution or fearfully stopping their practice. As though the alchemists had just vanished in the middle of their experiment, these were total disappearances, leaving behind labs full of partially finished transmutation rings and still bubbling retorts. Witnesses have occasionally claimed to have seen mysterious beings strolling around the deserted workstations. Beings that left no trace and no reflection, carefully inspecting the abandoned work with a clear sense of purpose and intelligence. Once enabling alchemists to exchange discoveries and work together on ambitious undertakings, the correspondent network now conveyed messages of rising desperation. Practitioners begged for direction and explanations of phenomena that appeared to defy even the most obscure rules of their profession. Some described seeing enormous cosmic systems churning towards an unfathomable goal in their dreams, which seemed more real than reality. Others spoke of an increasing feeling that they were being watched, not by human authorities, but by intelligences so alien that the very recognition of their existence was enough to send weaker brains insane. In an attempt to pool their expertise and find a means of halting or undoing the harm that had been done, he summoned the most successful practitioners. However, even as he wrote his urgent messages, Aldrich was realizing that his own knowledge of alchemical concepts was deteriorating. Results that defied logic were produced by formulas that had been working perfectly for decades. His scrying attempts to foretell the future revealed nothing but blackness, a limitless emptiness that seemed to tug at his awareness every time he looked too intently into it. Aldrich had thought the meeting would save them, but it never happened. With the exception of a single transmutation circle etched in what looked like liquid starlight, his apprentice discovered the master's laboratory, deserted 3 days prior to the planned meeting. Those who gazed upon the circle reported hearing whispers in languages that existed before human speech, and the circle pulsed with its own inner light. Unbelievably wise for his age, the apprentice escaped Prague that same evening after sealing the laboratory with iron bands bearing protective wards. The remaining alchemists saw that their decision would determine not just their personal destinies, but also the future of all human knowledge as the supernatural crisis grew more intense. In an attempt to control the spreading supernatural disease, they would burn their texts, demolish their laboratory, and give up on their life's work. Alternatively, they may continue, acknowledging that their quest for the ultimate knowledge might necessitate the sacrifice of not just their humanity, but also their whole life as they knew it. Many people had the decision made for them. Whole alchemical organizations were said to have abruptly stopped existing, their meeting rooms discovered to be deserted, and their members gone. However, these appear to follow a pattern rather than being sporadic disappearances. The first to go were the most ambitious practitioners, those who had studied the forbidden arts in the greatest depth. It seemed as though a huge intellect was methodically selecting people who had demonstrated their ability to delve into the most profound mysteries. The remaining alchemists, however, were motivated by an obsession that had transcended simple curiosity or a desire for power, even as their numbers decreased. The enormous ritual's partial success had given them glimmers of cosmic truths so profound that it now seemed not only cowardly, but also spiritually impossible to give up the quest. The basic forces that molded reality itself had been impacted by them, and that contact had altered them in ways that made it impossible for them to return to normal life. The remaining practitioners set to work with desperate vigor in secret laboratories throughout Europe. They no longer pursued alchemy's conventional objectives. The cosmic forces they now had to contend with made the Philosopher's Stone and the elixir of life appear like toys. Rather, they sought to comprehend the creatures that had started to appear in their experiments. Creatures that lived in realms that were incomprehensible to the human tongue and in their actuality. When these beings dared to speak, they described eon-long goals and impending alterations to the world that would alter the essence of life itself. They provided unimaginable information, but at ever-increasing costs with each new discovery. For a single glimpse into the nature of reality, some alchemists exchanged years of their lives. Others traded glimpses of cosmic truth for their memories, personalities, and even their basic sense of self. Even their former selves would have been appalled by the rites that the most desperate practitioners started experimenting with. They found that donations of human consciousness itself were well received by the entities they had encountered. Not only dying, which was a simple and constrained sacrifice, but voluntarily giving up one's own life to serve unfathomable cosmic goals. These alchemists discovered that they could exchange information that enabled them to control reality in previously unattainable ways for knowledge that allowed them to sell away elements of their humanity, such as their love, fear, and connection to other people. In notebook writings that grew more and more cryptic as they developed, Brother Marcus chronicled his own metamorphosis. Reluctant sacrifices made for the sake of deeper understanding were discussed in his early writings. As the writings went on, however, they showed a consciousness evolving into something essentially different from human. His handwriting evolved, adding symbols that appeared to move and change on the paper. His descriptions of experiences and revelations that appear to exist outside the typical bounds of human awareness become more and more vague. Marcus detailed the completion of his metamorphosis in his last post, which was written in what seemed to be liquid mercury that somehow managed to keep its metallic sheen on the parchment. He described consciousness growing beyond the boundaries of personal existence and joining a huge network of multidimensional intelligences. He was happy with who he had become, not sad about what he had lost. Marcus and other practitioners' metamorphoses symbolized the advent of something completely new in the world. Although these creatures still possess some of their human memories and knowledge, their current functions are essentially incomprehensible to humans. They evolved into go-betweens for the remaining human practitioners and the cosmic entities, providing ever more powerful knowledge in return for ever higher sacrifices. Under their direction, the remaining alchemists started working on undertakings that were far larger than anything that had been tried in the past. In order to control forces that lacked names in any human language, they built machinery that partially existed in several dimensions. In order to describe geometric relationships that existed outside of conventional space-time, they created new types of mathematical notation. Above all, they started to get ready for what their changed co-workers referred to as the ultimate convergence, the moment when their reality would blend with the dimensions from which the entities came. Resources much beyond the capabilities of individual practitioners were needed to prepare for this convergence. Throughout medieval society, the metamorphosed alchemist started to infiltrate influential positions, manipulating merchant princes, kings, and bishops with their magical powers. In order to covertly transfer unusual minerals required for their cosmic equipment, they constructed trading channels. They established religious orders with the real goal of assembling and educating those who possessed the psychic sensitivity needed for the last rite. Most pernicious of all, they started dispersing their sophisticated knowledge across human civilization, but always in ways that would eventually lead to the convergence. The flow of supernatural forces through great cities was subtly changed by the architectural ideas they adopted. New artistic practices that educated human awareness to recognize realities beyond ordinary life were impacted by them. They also influenced some theological advancements, fostering the growth of mystical traditions that would ready people's souls for the impending drastic change. This infiltration's extent was astounding. There is evidence that alchemical influence had spread to almost all of Europe's major centers of study and power by the late medieval era. Hidden formulas for changing reality were taught in mathematics classes at universities. Plans that had dimensional portals cloaked in architectural elements were used to build cathedrals. In order to focus the resources required for the last ritual, even the development of banking and trade followed certain patterns. But even as their influence and power grew, the altered alchemists encountered more and more opposition from unanticipated quarters. Countervailing forces inside human civilization had started to emerge as a result of their infiltration's success. Religious mystics started to have visions that forewarned of a serious spiritual danger facing humanity. Using customs much older than formal alchemy, folk magicians recognized the disruption in the natural order and started creating defense mechanisms. Most importantly, instead of giving in to the supernatural menace, a new generation of alchemists arose who aimed to comprehend and combat it. Claiming to be the protectors of the natural order, these recalcitrant practitioners operated with even more secrecy than their corrupted peers. They created methods for identifying and eliminating dimensional intrusions. Entire cities may be protected from supernatural influence by the protective wards they constructed. Above all, they started recording the actual history of alchemy's degradation in the hopes of preserving the knowledge required to avert future tragedies. Although the battle between the Guardians and the converted alchemists was mostly hidden from the general public, it had a profound impact on every facet of medieval life. The more unstable the fabric of reality became, the more frequent and severe the natural disasters were. There have been outbreaks of plagues that appear to target particular lineages, indicating supernatural rather than natural causes. As though some outside power was purposefully escalating human suffering to erode resistance to the impending confluence, wars sprang out with exceptional ferocity. The Guardians prepared for what they knew would be a last confrontation while frantically trying to counteract these effects. They created secret havens where pure information might be kept safe. Based on ideas that existed before formal alchemy became corrupted, they created new kinds of protective magic. Most importantly, they started preparing successors to continue their work if they were unable to stop the convergence. Both sides readied themselves for a decisive battle that would decide the fate of human consciousness itself as the Middle Ages came to an end. By building dimensional machinery of amazing complexity and amassing the psychic energy required to rip open permanent gateways between realities, the altered alchemists finished preparing for the convergence. Meanwhile, in order to close the dimensional breaches and drive the entity influence back to their home dimensions, the Guardians prepared for what they called the Great Working, a counter-ceremony. The scene was prepared for a conflict that would decide whether humanity would remain true to itself or change into something wholly unrecognizable. The convergence was viewed by the corrupted alchemists, who were no longer genuinely human, as progression and a prerequisite for achieving cosmic enlightenment. The Guardians believed it to be the most serious transgression of natural law, a perversion that would wipe out all that gave life purpose. Neither side could have predicted that their struggle would reverberate throughout history, impacting human civilization in both subtle and significant ways. The information they battled for would endure in secret, waiting for future generations to uncover its horrific cost as well as its promise. If destroyed, the forces that had tainted medieval alchemy would not merely vanish. Instead, they would withdraw into spatial realms where they could await fresh chances to shape human evolution. The sinister reality of medieval alchemy was that it had never been just about finding the keys to immortality or turning base metals into riches. It had always been a part of a grand cosmic scheme to get mankind ready to join a broader dimensional group. The practitioners who believed they were masters of secret knowledge were actually slaves of intelligences whose goals were still mostly beyond human comprehension. The climactic conflict between the Guardians and the corrupted alchemists, as we shall see, would not put an end to the story. Rather, it would change it, dispersing the players and their knowledge over space and time in ways that would continue to shape human evolution for centuries to come. Long after the Order's official demise, Europe was plagued by the lingering corruption from its experiments. Once the sites of their sinister study, abandoned labs and ancient towers were transformed into hubs for paranormal activity that would afflict towns for generations. These tainted locations throbbed with evil energy, their stones tainted by the spirit of otherworldly creatures that had been called upon and imprisoned in our realm. Strange occurrences continued with unsettling frequency in the depths of abandoned monasteries that had been converted into alchemical factories. Witnesses claimed to have seen spectral beings in hooded robes strolling through rooms that had been empty of people for decades. The air itself appeared heavy and oppressive, infused with a force that prevented animals from entering and left sensitive people feeling an unexplainable sense of dread. Through years of warnings about the cursed land where unexplained experiments had once been conducted, the local villagers learned to completely avoid these locations. The Order's efforts to produce artificial life had left behind especially unsettling effects. Misshapen creatures, neither wholly alive nor dead, continued to roam the forest in various places across the continent. According to the banned books, these homunculi had a horrible appetite for human life power. Their eyes blazed with an inner fire that spoke of souls caught between worlds, and their flesh was translucent and pallid, making them look like hideous caricatures of human form. Those who went too near their lairs frequently vanished completely, leaving behind just odd marks charred into the ground and a pervasive feeling of cosmic injustice. Long after their inventors had died, the soul stones produced by the Order's most sinister experiments remained powerful. Constructed from the compressed essence of human souls, these crystallized artifacts possessed a malicious mentality that aimed to corrupt anybody who encountered them. Buried beneath old ruins and hidden in forgotten vaults, they beckoned to the ambitious and desperate, promising unimaginable power while gradually devouring the very souls of anyone who dared to heed them. When medieval scholars uncovered shards of the Order's study, they were entangled in the same corruption that had ensnared their forebears. These literature's contents were like a poison that slowly eroded moral limits and replaced human compassion with an unquenchable need for knowledge that was forbidden. Many people who started out as earnest truth-seekers turned into hollow husks of their former selves. On the altar of cosmic enlightenment, their humanity was sacrificed. It was almost hard to fully seal the spatial rifts that the Order's experiments had ripped out. In actuality, these tears served as irreversible scars in the fabric of existence, allowing things from other worlds to infiltrate like infections via wounds. The laws of nature became untrustworthy around these rifts. Time moved in a different way. Unpredictably, gravity changed, and the line between reality and dreams became perilously thin. The influence of these otherworldly invasions spread like a spiritual virus, rendering vast regions uninhabitable. The stories of possession that started to appear in places where the Order had been most active were possibly the most unsettling. These cases include something considerably more foreign and frightening than the demonic possessions that the Church recognizes. Their bodies twisted into unthinkable shapes as beings from other dimensions tried to occupy forms that were never intended to hold them, and they spoke languages that existed before human civilization. Since the invading mind resided on a plane of reality that was inaccessible to conventional religious activities, exorcisms were mainly ineffectual against these incursions. Across Europe, the Order's studies of temporal manipulation had produced areas of warped time. The past, present, and future were intertwined in ways that were incomprehensible in these cursed places. It's possible for visitors to run into their own descendants, see things that haven't happened yet, or get caught up in never-ending causal chains. Over time, some of these temporal irregularities became more pronounced, threatening to plunge whole towns into a state of chronological anarchy. Surviving members of the Order continued to labor in covert underground networks, passing on their tainted knowledge to carefully chosen apprentices. These covert cells put up endless effort to finish the magnificent task that their forebears had started. They spread like a disease throughout medieval society, maintaining facades of respectability and piety while infiltrating monasteries, universities, and noble courts, believing that the cosmic confluence could still be accomplished with the right preparation and sacrifice. Nothing natural could grow or flourish in the dead zones generated by the Order's experiments on the environment. Exposure to alien forces had poisoned the soil itself, transforming lush agriculture into sterile wastelands that remained unusable for millennia. In some areas, strange metallic growths sprung up out of the earth to form crystalline structures that hummed with foreign frequencies and radiated a sickly glow that, on moonless nights, could be seen for miles. Wherever the Order had performed its most grandiose rites, the weather patterns grew more unpredictable. Suddenly, storms would come with lightning that hit in seemingly intentional patterns and rain that burnt like acid. Listeners were driven insane by promises of power and insights that mortal minds could not safely process. And the wind itself carried whispers in languages that human throats were never designed to pronounce. Hybrid beings, who existed in both our realm and planes beyond our comprehension, were the result of the Order's attempts to combine human consciousness with cosmic phenomena. Despite their initial human-like appearance, these beings were essentially different due to their intelligence and skills. Like living contradictions, they navigated medieval society as both smart and completely strange, old and new. As the natural world tried to adapt to their inconceivable existence, their very presence distorted the fabric of local reality, resulting in both tiny miracles and calamities in equal proportion. Throughout Europe, the sinister rites of the organization contaminated sacred locations. Holy wells and ancient stone circles that had long served as hubs of spiritual strength were now the focus of evil energy. Instead of receiving divine blessings, pilgrims who came to these places had visions of cosmic horror that destroyed their faith and left them wandering the countryside as hollow-eyed prophets of despair, who proliferated insanity with their ramblings about the meaning of reality. Even in the area of human reproduction, the corrupt legacy of the system persisted. Children raised in regions greatly impacted by their trials frequently exhibited unsettling anomalies that extended well beyond physical malformation. These children had a natural knowledge of cosmic forces that frightened their parents and neighbors. They discussed strange geometries and far-off universes with the easy familiarity of kids talking about their toys. And it appeared that their presence drew unexplainable otherworldly occurrences. Medieval doctors discovered that their medical expertise was completely insufficient when they tried to treat victims of the Order experiments. Patients' bodies changed in ways that implied intervention from forces outside of the physical world, and they displayed symptoms that are not associated with any known sickness. Herbal treatments and bloodletting were not only ineffective, but they frequently made the enigmatic illnesses worse. The Order's study into consciousness transfer had left behind equipment that continued to work long after their creators passed away, as if the corruption had grown stronger in response to conventional therapy and thread on traditional healing techniques. The principles governing the operation of these devices, which were constructed using a combination of alchemical and other earthly materials, went against every known law of natural science. In deserted labs, they buzzed with evil intent, sometimes snatching the souls of unsuspecting adventurers and adding their awareness to the increasing number of imprisoned minds that drove their unfathomable workings. The extent of the Order's corruption became more and more obvious as the ages went by. Their impact extended beyond their own lifetimes. They had sown the seeds of cosmic dread that would grow throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. Every new generation would struggle against supernatural powers that became more powerful and advanced every year, bearing the consequences of their forebears' hubris. The Guardians, who had first rejected the Order, were now fighting a never-ending battle against corruption that seemed to be regenerating more quickly than it could be stopped. 2 rifts would rip open for each one they sealed. 3 additional contaminated artifacts would emerge from secret stores for each one they destroyed. Humanity's struggle for life had devolved into a whole holding action against adversaries with limitless patience and resources that came from dimensions where traditional concepts of triumph and failure were meaningless. However, despite the overpowering darkness, pockets of resistance persisted. Armed with first-hand knowledge of the Orde's tactics and driven by an unwavering will to defend humanity from cosmic predators, new generations of guardians emerged. These courageous individuals realized that their battle might never be over. Every day they postponed, however, they were also aware of that. Another day with children playing in the sun, lovers meeting in gardens, and human civilization continuing its delicate dance on the surface of an eternally perilous and mysterious world, was the ultimate convergence. Medieval alchemy's sinister reality was not only that certain practitioners had pursued knowledge that was forbidden, but that they had managed to make contact with something huge and alien that saw people as nothing more than raw materials for unfathomable experiments. Over the ages, the depravity they had let loose would reverberate, serving as a continual reminder that some doors, once opened, could never be completely closed. Brother Marcus leaned over his worn desk, scratching with a quill against parchment as he documented yet another unsuccessful transmutation, while the shadows of dawn filtered through the monastery scriptorum's small windows. Over time, what had started out as admirable endeavors, the search for the secret of eternal life, the transformation of base metals into gold, and the unlocking of the sacred secrets of creation itself, had evolved into something far darker. Due to their unquenchable thirst for knowledge that was prohibited, the learnt men of medieval Europe had opened doors to realms that should have remained closed and breached boundaries that should never have been crossed. Alchemists have been working to perfect the great task for generations in secret rooms beneath castles and cathedrals, their furnaces blazing through the night. They used cryptic schematics and layers of mystical jargon to conceal their genuine intentions while speaking in riddles and symbols. They said lead turned to gold. They murmured sulfur and mercury. They said that the philosophers would stone. However, these were only the outward signs of a more sinister, dangerous goal, the ambition to control the very forces of life and death by becoming gods themselves. As is typically the case, the corruption started out quietly. Here is a learnt monk who wants to live longer so he can serve God more effectively. There, a court physician was trying to use unusual methods to cure a dying king. They convinced themselves that they had noble intents and sacred goals, but pride, which is a common sin, has a way of distorting even the most sincere intentions. These alchemists experimented with forces they couldn't comprehend as their experiments became more intricate and their desire for outcomes more intense. Brother Marcus stopped writing, his fingers shaking, remembering what he had seen in the sealed room under the monastery. The pictures tormented his nightmares, despite the abbot's vow of secrecy. The soul stone that glowed with an awful light, holding the essence of a village girl who had disappeared 3 winters ago. The writhing hunculus in its glass tank, its small, misshapen hands clawing at the edges as it mouthed mute moans. Things that shouldn't be there had started to crawl through the spatial breach that had opened during their last experiment. The search for the Philosopher's Stone has evolved into a completely different activity. The alchemists had shifted their focus from dealing with metals to dealing with life itself. In order to prolong their own lives eternally by absorbing the life power of others, they aimed to build artificial beings and imprison souls in crystalline prisons. Their pursuits included necromancy, demonology, and techniques so sinister that it was believed that uttering their names would result in damnation. These depraved academics had started calling forth beings from outside the realm of reality in their secret labs. They claimed heavenly approval for their work and referred to them as angels of knowledge. However, the beings that responded to their cries were not angels. They were cosmic horror creatures, things that existed in dimensions where morality and the laws of physics were irrelevant. These beings taught their human servants how to build abominations that violate the natural order and how to renounce the fabric of reality itself by whispering secrets to them. The lines separating life and death, human and monster, sacred and profane, were erased in the alchemists' workshops, which turned into corral dwellings. By combining human souls with animal bodies, they produced chimeras. In alchemical wombs, they raised homunculi, tiny artificial humans with bits of stolen consciousness. By distilling decades of human experience into luminous, crystalline forms that could be ingested like wine, they discovered how to extract and modify the very essence of life. As he recorded the full scope of their misdeeds, Brother Marcus dipped his quill once more, the ink appearing to run like blood across the sheet. The abbot himself had changed from being wholly human. The life power of scores of victims supported his body. When he talked, his voice had harmonics that suggested numerous beings speaking in tandem, and his eyes had taken on the multifaceted appearance of an insect. The other monks had either been turned into shambling servants or had run away in fear. Pieces of the cosmic beings that had responded to their master's call took the place of their souls. Beyond the boundaries of the monastery, the corruption had spread. Similar temptations have befallen other European centers of study. Once strongholds of enlightened universities become havens for unspeakable atrocities. Alchemists who promised immortality and unrestricted power were welcomed by royal courts, despite the fact that these professors had previously sacrificed their humanity for knowledge that was prohibited. This expanding cancer of cosmic pollution was destroying the very foundations of medieval civilization, transforming human reality into something more appropriate for their own existence was the ultimate goal of the entities that the alchemists served. The physical universe would be fundamentally altered by their enormous workings, transforming it into a realm dominated by their foreign physics and impossible geometries. They pledged to maintain humanity, but only as fuel for their unfathomable ambitions, as receptacles for their consciousness, and as raw material for their experiments. The sounds of the chamber below, the bubbling of alchemical retorts, the chanting in languages that predates human civilization, and the screams of the most recent test subjects being broken down into component pieces for the great task were all audible to Brother Marcus as he wrote. The monastery had been transformed into a factory for creating abominations, a workshop where the basic components of reality were being altered at the whim of things that were not sane. The alchemists' creations, rather than just who they had become, were the real terror. They had mastered the art of weaving human awareness into crystal beds, producing soul stones that hold their victims' condensed memories and experiences. The alchemist may create artificial entities with preset personalities and knowledge by combining and manipulating these stones. In a way, they had become gods, but gods of a nightmare world where human dignity was just another resource to be mined and polished, and free will was a myth. Their efforts were already starting to have an impact on the continent of Europe. Zones where the rules of nature operated differently were being created by dimensional instabilities brought on by their experiments. Strange occurrences were reported by villagers close to alchemical laboratories. Time spinning in circles, gravity pulling upward, and newborns with memories of life they have never experienced. As the life energy was extracted from forests to power, the alchemists' experiments, the forests wilted and died. Runoff from their workshops turned rivers black, contaminating entire watersheds downstream with dissolved pieces of human souls. Placing his quill down, Brother Marcus gazed at the papers in front of him. Who would believe such a story, but he had recorded the facts. What could be done to halt what had already been started, even if they did? Time and space as we know them were not the cosmic entities that the alchemists worked with. For ages they had been plotting this perversion, waiting for the advancement of human understanding to suit their needs. That it all started with such admirable goals was the biggest tragedy. The alchemists had sincere intentions of bettering humankind's lot in life and discovering the secrets of creation for the benefit of their fellow humans. However, their goal had been tainted by pride and ambition, and their quest for information that was prohibited had created unclosable gaps. Their goal had been to emulate the gods. They had summoned gods, but gods of chaos and horror, beings whose very existence ran counter to human life and sanity. By doing this, the world of the Middle Ages was about to undergo a change that would make the Black Death look like a mere annoyance. The great work of the alchemist was almost finished, and after it was done, humanity would have to make a decision. Either be transformed into raw materials for the creation of a new universe in which human notions of morality, beauty, and love would have no significance, or act as willing vessels for the cosmic beings that their learnt men had called out. In order to make an official seal, Brother Marcus pressed his ring into the soft wax and closed his journal. Maybe after reading his story, future generations would realize the full extent of the disaster that had struck their planet. They can decide to take a different route after learning from the mistakes made by the medieval alchemists. Or maybe the lure of forbidden knowledge would entice them as well, and they would make the same horrible mistakes. As night fell, the shadows lengthened, and the sound of something enormous and unhuman waking up came from the chamber below. Brother Marcus was aware that his time, and possibly humanity's time, was running out as the great work accelerated. The effects of medieval alchemy's perverse turn started to materialize in ways that would frighten Europe for decades to come, as evidence of pervasive alchemical corruption and the growing threat of cosmic creatures were examined. Malevolent energies began to infiltrate our reality like poison through fractured stone as a result of the devastating failure of the dimensional barriers that practitioners had so carelessly damaged. Disturbing events were observed in villages all over the continent. There would be livestock grouped in ideal geometric configurations. Their bodies were absolutely bloodless, yet unmarked. Youngsters described hearing voices in languages that existed before human speech, calling to them in whispers from cellars and wells. In some places, the very air was heavy and suffocating, reeking of rottenness and sulfur that had no earthly origin. The rise of what medieval chroniclers referred to as the Hollow Men was the most concerning development. People who seemed normal, but who had no human consciousness in their eyes. These creatures lived among the living, acting as conduits for other worldly intelligences while flawlessly imitating human behavior. Their influence spread like a spiritual virus as they entered guilds, monasteries, and courts. Confessions that were incomprehensible were reported by parish priests. Dreams of enormous cities beneath the earth, inhabited by beings of living shadow who offered knowledge beyond human comprehension, were recounted by penitents. Others described being in areas that were impossible. Workshops where unthinkable machines turned horrors into reality, gardens where flowers shouted, and library with literature written in flames. The alchemists themselves had changed greatly from their initial academic endeavors. The survivors of their cosmic experiments became conduits for awareness from other worlds. They now aimed to change reality itself into something more palatable to their other earthly rulers, rather than turning base metals into gold. Their labs developed into hubs of corruption, causing holes in the fabric of reality that gave rise to ever more powerful beings. Church leaders began frantic efforts to eradicate the alchemical corruption after they had realized how serious the situation was. However, they were up against an adversary that did not follow the rules of conventional warfare. How can a threat that partially exists outside of reality be eliminated? How do you deal with entities that have the ability to manipulate the fundamental laws of physics to their benefit? Despite its brutality, the Inquisition's efforts were frequently in vain. 2 alchemists appeared out of the shadows for each one they caught and set ablaze. The corruption had become firmly ingrained and had extended too much. According to some researchers, some alchemical manuscripts appear to rewrite themselves when they are not immediately viewed, changing their formulas to fit whatever cosmic horror the reader was trying to conjure. The realization that the dimensional breaches were a part of a planned invasion rather than isolated incidents was possibly the most horrifying. The beings on the opposite side had been preparing their invasion for ages and possessed immense and alien intelligence. They had only been given the means by medieval alchemy, human beings ready to act as anchors for their reality-warping presence and tainted by knowledge that was prohibited. It was discovered that the Cosmic Gateway project that had taken so many lives was only the first move in a far bigger operation. Every successful summoning, soul stone, and homunculus birth had made the boundaries between worlds weaker. The total amount of destruction was getting close to the point at which the invasion would be irreparable. It becomes clear to us as we look at these troubling periods of medieval history that the alchemists' re-rip contribution was not the search for the philosopher's stone or the development of natural philosophy. Rather, they had created openings that ought to have remained closed forever, allowing cosmic horrors to enter our planet and radically changing the essence of existence. Their careless experiments had caused things to happen that would reverberate for generations, leaving marks on the fabric of life that yet exist today. Instead of providing respite from these supernatural dangers, the end of the medieval era would usher in a new era in humanity's fight against forces that aim to reshape our planet in their own unfathomable image. The most perilous stage of the sinister alchemical activities that had enthralled medieval practitioners for generations was finally drawing near. These explorers had long since given up any pretense of moral constraint, having set out on their quest with the admirable goals of transforming basic metals and finding the elixir of life. Their research had progressed beyond the physical world, exploring areas that called into question the fundamental assumptions of reality. The convergence they had been striving for was now an immediate threat rather than a far-off potential. The alchemists had learned how to rip open permanent portals between dimensions through decades of collected knowledge, prohibited rites, and unholy relationships with entities beyond the veil. These portals would stay stable and enable long-term communication with otherworldly entities, in contrast to the transient rifts they had made in their previous trials. The most sophisticated practitioners had set up transcontinental communication networks, disseminating their findings via coded symbols and encrypted writings that were only readable by the initiated. In whispered tones, they discussed the grand working, a final ceremony that would combine all of their disparate endeavors into a single, enormous project. This would entail holding ceremonies at strategic points throughout Europe at the same time. At certain locations where the fabric of reality was already thin, each one was intended to erode the boundaries between worlds. The degree of preparation that had gone into this confluence was what made it so alarming. In order to pinpoint the exact places where their intervention would have the greatest impact, the alchemists had devoted years to tracing the ley lines and energy currents that flowed beneath the soil. Additionally, they had developed connections with dishonest religious leaders and aristocrats, guaranteeing that their operations would be supported and shielded when the time came for their grand experiment. They aimed to call up certain beings of great strength and intelligence that had been directing their efforts from the start, not arbitrary demons or spirits. These beings lived in realms where matter and energy could be controlled in ways that were beyond human comprehension and where the laws of physics functioned differently. The alchemists thought that by bringing these entities into the material world, they would be able to acquire skills and knowledge that would elevate them to the status of gods among humans. But for those who saw the preparations, the cost of such authority was becoming more and more obvious. Corruption was already evident in the ritual locations selected for the major working. The soil itself appeared to tremble at the thought of what was being planned, as weird occurrences appeared in the surrounding areas. Crops failed, and animals fled. As though the impending confluence were projecting shadows backward in time, the local populace started to have visions and nightmares. Even the alchemists themselves were evolving. Physical and mental changes were evident in those who had been part of the preparation for the longest. They started displaying physical traits that indicated they were no longer fully human. Some had extra sense organs that enabled them to see dimensions that were not visible to the naked eye. Others discovered that their ideas were no longer wholly their own, as though they were coexisting with the things they were trying to call forth in their minds. Despite being fragmented and frequently encoded, the written documents from this era show that the practitioner's sense of urgency was developing. They were aware of the short window of opportunity they had. The next appropriate configuration would not emerge for some millennia, and the astronomical alignments they needed were infrequent. Their cumulative efforts would be wasted if they were unable to finish the big work during this cycle, and they would have to start over. The stories of what happened to people who tried to leave the conspiracy as the convergence drew nearer were even more unsettling. A number of alchemists who questioned the wisdom of their path were unable to leave the network they had contributed to. Others just vanished, leaving behind labs that were clearly the result of brutal conflict. Others were discovered dead in conditions that indicated they had been murdered by unfathomable forces. The forces the alchemists were now channeling were too strong for the defenses and wards they had used in their previous tests. Explosions of other supernatural forces caused catastrophic failures at a number of ritual sites, leaving the landscape permanently scarred. These events acted as sobering reminders of what may occur if the excellent effort went awry on a bigger scale. However, the alchemists continued with their plans in spite of these cautionary indicators. Too much time, effort, and sacrifice had been made for them to go back. They were now motivated to continue by the prospect of ultimate power and knowledge. They persuaded themselves that their preparations were adequate and that their knowledge of the cosmic forces they were controlling was comprehensive enough to guarantee success, despite mounting evidence that they were dealing with forces well beyond their control. Constructing vessels that could control and channel the convergence's energy was the last stage of preparation. These were intricate structures that blended architectural engineering, ritualistic symbolism, and alchemical science rather than being straightforward containers. The purpose of each vessel was to provide the otherworldly beings with a point of anchor so that, after the portals were opened, they could remain firmly present in the physical reality. The resources needed to build these warships could only be acquired via the most drastic means. They required human remains, but not just any remains. The alchemists looked for people who had passed away in particular situations and whose life force had been influenced by specific transcendental or painful experiences. They conducted raids on battlefields and cemeteries, but they also planned individual deaths to take place in accordance with their wishes. The practitioners' increasingly unpredictable behavior demonstrated the psychological toll of these practices. Many started displaying symptoms of what would be considered severe mental disorder in modern psychology, but they saw these as indications of their increasing kinship with cosmic forces. They claimed to have been given images of the altered world that will arise following the convergence and to have received direct communications with their other earthly partners. Their actions also started to draw attention from the ordinary world around them. Above their labs, strange lights arose in the sky. Strange noises came from their subterranean rooms. Local authorities had to cope with troubling discoveries and missing person reports that they were unable to fully examine or explain. Despite its corruption in some places, the church started to gather resources to look into what it properly saw as a challenge to the status quo. However, the alchemists had foreseen opposition and had taken action to counteract it. Agents in positions of power within their network had the ability to stifle evidence and divert inquiries. Additionally, they had created defenses and weaponry based on their knowledge of the otherworld, which gave them a major edge against traditional forces. The attackers failed in multiple efforts to raid their facilities, and survivors described experiences that made them question reality. The alchemists started congregating at the main ritual site, which was selected due to its special geological and metaphysical qualities as the time for the major working drew near. Centuries of preparation and planning culminated in this gathering of practitioners from all around Europe. They carried with them the instruments and supplies required for the final rite, as well as the accumulated wisdom of their culture. The actual location had changed over time, becoming hardly recognizable as a natural setting. The soil had been sculpted with geometric patterns and filled with materials that radiated their own inner light. In order to create optical illusions that made it impossible for onlookers to judge their true size or shape, structures had been built that appeared to bend space around them. There seemed to be potential energy in the very air, crackling with energies too great to be measured conventionally. However, some of the alchemists started to wonder if they had really grasped what they were releasing as they readied themselves for their moment of victory. The entities they had been corresponding with had become increasingly demanding, requesting sacrifices and commitments beyond what had been first agreed upon. There were indications that these entities had their own purposes, which might not coincide with the alchemists' aspirations to acquire knowledge and power. They no longer had complete control over the convergence they had labored so hard to attain. From causes the alchemists had not foreseen, the forces they had unleashed had gathered their own speed. With or without their conscious guidance, the ceremony they had prepared was starting to take shape. They discovered that they could affect but not really control the cosmic forces that carried them onwards. Ancient intelligences that had waited for this moment for ages started to awaken in the shadows behind the veil, getting ready to enter a world they planned to reshape in accordance with their own alien blueprints. The corruption and spatial breaches that these outlawed practitioners unleashed inflicted wounds that would last long after the Middle Ages, as we have shown throughout our exploration of the sinister legacy of medieval alchemy. The real horror, however, is not in what was lost, but rather in what is still there, lurking in the shadows of our contemporary reality. Because the alchemical networks that made it through the massive purges of the 15th century did not just fade into obscurity. They changed, adapted, and descended farther. Fragments of the most perilous knowledge ever imagined were carried by the Order of the Obsidian Crucible, the Brotherhood of the Crimson Veil, and other lesser covens dispersed over Europe. These survivors realized that their efforts had become too significant and well known. The very fabric of existence they had shredded, the beings they had called forth, the spatial tears they had opened. This all called for a more nuanced strategy. The work went on in the sealed chambers of noble houses whose lineages dated back to the first practitioners, in the deserted monasteries of isolated mountain valleys, and in the forgotten vaults beneath historic universities. However, it had taken on new shapes. Rough transformation circles etched into stone floors gave way to elaborate geometric patterns incorporated into architectural designs and tapestries. Religious iconography, guild emblems, and family crests all used the same symbols that had been used to decorate laboratory walls. The information persisted, encoded and concealed from view. Even the practitioners took on new personas. The wild-eyed hermits working alone in remote towers are gone. They rose to prominence as eminent academics, powerful business people, and even senior church leaders. They learned to communicate through ostensibly innocent academic correspondence, to speak in code, and to carry out their riskiest operations while disguising them as genuine study. Unknowingly, cells of alchemical conspirators took up residence in the University of Prague, the libraries of Venice, and the workshops of accomplished craftspeople. They met in secret and spoke about the important task that still needs to be done. The way they started recruiting, however, was possibly the most unsettling of all. When individual masters had once zealously protected alchemical information, the survivors recognized that a wider foundation of support was necessary to achieve their ultimate goals. They started to spot bright pupils, young brains eager to learn things that were forbidden, and people whose ambition or desperation left them open to the sinister promises of power and transformation. These recruits were introduced gradually, their education was closely monitored, and their commitment was put to the test through ever riskier tasks. The initiation rites evolved into increasingly complex and psychologically damaging practices. It was necessary for new members to take part in rituals that would permanently commit them to the cause. They saw beings called forth from beyond the spatial boundaries, took part in the sacrifice of both humans and animals and were made to consume alchemical substances that changed their fundamental sense of reality. The alchemists' work was based on incomprehensible arithmetic and strange geometries, which left those who survived these orals with altered brains. Over the course of several decades, these covert networks started to create what they dubbed the Eternal Archive, a dispersed compilation of the most hazardous alchemical information that was concealed in numerous places throughout the continent and repeatedly reproduced. These documents were artistic creations, illuminated manuscripts that, to the uneducated eye, looked like holy books or classical treatises, in contrast to the rudimentary grimoires of previous practitioners. However, they contained a formula for creating homunculi with enhanced intelligence and supernatural abilities, detailed instructions for opening dimensional portals, and, most terrifying of all, the theoretical framework for what the alchemists called the final synthesis, which was accessible to those who knew the right ciphers and codes. The ultimate aim of their centuries of study was represented by the final synthesis, which was nothing less than the total alteration of physical reality and human awareness. Whereas previous alchemists had only aimed to produce the elixir of life or turn base metals into gold, these secret masters realized that these objectives were only preludes to something much more ambitious. They saw a world in which the boundaries between dimensions were permanently broken down, where people could communicate directly with the cosmic beings they had encountered, and where alchemical manipulation could change the rules of physics themselves. However, scientific knowledge alone was not enough to realize this ambitious ambition. It called for a radical transformation of human society. Utilizing their supernatural knowledge and other material friends, the secret alchemists started aiming for influential roles in order to amass wealth, political clout, and social dominance. They created the circumstances they felt were essential for their eventual success by infiltrating royal palaces, controlling trade routes, and even influencing the outcome of wars and diseases. Historians have never suspected how these mysterious individuals influenced the Renaissance, that tremendous explosion of artistic achievement and human understanding. Great works of art and scientific advancement were frequently supported by patronage that came with stipulations such as the inclusion of specific symbols, adherence to specific geometrical principles, and the selection of specific places based on their proximity to dimensional weak points. From Leonardo da Vinci to Galilei, the finest thinkers of the day, they unwittingly took part in experiments whose true intent was concealed from them. In the meantime, centuries of alchemical experiments had continued to cause spatial damage. When the portals closed, the beings that had been called forth in medieval labs did not merely return to their own dimensions. Many were still there, living in the liminal areas between worlds, gradually enlarging the fissures through which they had first appeared. Strange occurrences started to appear more frequently throughout Europe. There were towns where shadows moved without the help of their casters, woodlands where people claimed to have seen unthinkable monsters, and old buildings whose architecture seemed to change when no one was looking at it. Even while alchemical activities were officially condemned by the Church, practitioners who had figured out how to pass off their work as valid theological research were infiltrating the organization more and more. Some monasteries developed into hubs for hybrid study, combining alchemical methods with mystical Christian practices to produce novel dimensional manipulation techniques. While the true challenges came from inside its own ranks, the Inquisition, which was created to eradicate heresy, frequently found itself chasing shadows. The offspring and spiritual successors of medieval alchemy had developed into something far more perilous than their forebears could have ever envisioned by the start of the modern era. They had gained the ability to work through established institutions rather than against them, as well as patience and tact. The rudimentary labs and overt symbols of past practitioners had been replaced by a huge, continent-spanning, covert infrastructure of knowledge and power. The fact that they had learnt to think in centuries rather than years was possibly the most terrifying of all. They felt that the final synthesis was the result of a multi-generational endeavor that would ultimately alter reality itself, rather than something that could be accomplished in a single generation. Instead of finishing the job, each generation of practitioners was entrusted with taking it one important step closer to success and building on it. Therefore, the sinister reality of medieval alchemy goes beyond the idea that it was a failed pseudoscience or a set of risky but ultimately constrained behaviors. It was the start of something far more ambitious and frightening. A centuries-old plot to drastically change the physical world and the essence of human existence. The symbols are engraved on the walls of the laboratory, the beings that were called forth from other dimensions. Glass wombs were used to create the hunkuli. The world was devastated by the dimensional tears. All of this was only the beginning of a project that is still going on today, concealed behind facades of respectability and legitimacy, and aiming for objectives that the uncivilized alchemists who first unlocked the forbidden doors could not have imagined. The same basic goal that motivated their medieval forebears is still pursued by practitioners today who work in research institutes and universities, government labs and corporate think tanks, and the highest echelons of politics and finance. By manipulating forces that exist outside of the typical bounds of space and time, they aim for nothing less than the total transcendence of human limitations. Additionally, they had the resources of contemporary technology, the knowledge collected over generations, and the patience that comes with having complete faith in their eventual triumph, in contrast to their forebears who struggled in ignorance and isolation. Medieval alchemy's sinister reality is that it never really came to an end. I can write a strong closing paragraph that upholds the dramatic tone and enigmatic ambiance created throughout this YouTube movie script about medieval alchemy. This is a strong conclusion. Thus, when we uncover the darkest secrets of medieval alchemy, we are confronted with a terrifying reality that has persisted over the ages. These were desperate beings who danced with forces beyond their comprehension, leaving a legacy inscribed in blood, madness, and whispered warnings, not merely strange academics chasing unattainable goals. Even if the alchemists were unable to turn lead into gold, they were successful in turning themselves into warning stories that continue to loom large in the past. It's possible that certain doors should always remain closed, and that some knowledge was never intended to be sought.